the spirit of India. In this session, we would be joined with Sriram, Devatha, and Mohua, Chinappa. Can we have a huge round of applause for the guests for the day? And I request both the speakers to kindly join us on the dais. This is a very special session as we would be witnessing a book launch, Amrut, the Great Churn. The global story of India's first single malt is the tale of how a homegrown brand attained international cult status. More than that, how it made Indian consumers believe in it. The story is about the journey, and the author here will be sharing his learning through his stories. Without any further delay, let me hand it over to the speakers for this session. Can we have a huge round of applause, everyone? Over to you, ma'am.
For that absolutely amazing introduction. So I don't think I really need to introduce myself too much because the man of the hour right now is Sriram Devatha. And so I think the first question that I would ask Sriram was this, that what inspired you to write Amrut, the Great Churn, and any particular moment that led you to explore the story behind the brand? What made you do this?
So this has multiple sort of layers to it, but one of the main meta layer I would say was, so everyone talks about the India being the bright spot now, right, in the economy where there's wars, there's gloom and doom all around, but India seems to be chugging along. How do you personify something like that? That feels very abstract, right? So what sort of immediately jumped out when I read, obviously I Googled and I saw what was written about Amrut so far, was how this company with simple family resources had done incredible stuff. In fact, they've launched, I'll give away one example. They had launched this expression called the Amrut spectrum. And they had designed a barrel that no one in 400 years of whiskey had done, even Scots, right? And it's just silently happening and they're going about their business. And I was like, okay, this is a very good small example to show that where India is going and India is rising. And that is, again, I will qualify it by saying that it was not to say that everything is right, but there are some things that are really working and we need to talk about that. I don't think we talk enough of that. So that was at one level. Next, who doesn't like a rags to riches story? We all like it, right? We all want the underdog to win. Amrut at some level is the underdog. It not only had to overcome the biases that Indians themselves had. We would have not believed it 10, 15 years ago that a bottle of Amrut could sell for $2,000. Indians themselves couldn't believe it. And imagine the West. The whiskey, as far as it went, was 4 countries. America, USA there, Canada, you had Ireland and Scotland. No one else made whiskey, right? And the Japanese made an initial entry, and then Indian single malts went in. So all of these things, I felt it was local, Indian, and global at the same time. I felt all of that ticked off in the story at some level, right?
So Amrit Fusion is one of the brand's flagship product, right? And how do you think was the strategies and what were the strategies that really put this brand out onto the world map and become among the top players in the field of single malts?
Obviously, everyone, if you know Amrut and you drink whiskey, Amrut Fusion is the likely expression you would have tried because it's widely available and very affordable. But the first breakthrough came with the acceptance of Amrut because once they won an award in the Whiskey Bible, right, by Jim Murray, then all hell broke loose because this is the interesting thing about the business bit, right? How do you discover stuff? In the previous session, they were talking about how wines are presented to you. But if you are not a whiskey aficionado, how do you decide what is good, what is bad? So you would typically, at least in the West, you relied on certain influencers. You saw what they said. And the moment Mr. Jim Murray put Amrut on third, best whiskey in the world, people lost it. They had the reverse problem of meeting the supply. I remember Ashok telling me, the head distiller, Ashok sir, I got calls at 2 in the morning from shops in the UK saying we don't have enough stock, supply. But just about 6 months ago, he was struggling to sell those cases. So it flipped very quickly. But a lot of things went in, right? One I told you is the innovation with the product. One was how they used blind tasting, right? A classic case, if most people, some people will be aware here, was the cola wars in the 70s. The Coca-Cola and Pepsi were going at each other, trying to outdo each other, and Pepsi was lagging at some point. And you know what they did? One thing, of course, a lot of things happened, but one interesting thing that Pepsi did, because Coke had a very strong brand. How do you overcome when you're a new entrant, limited resources? So what Pepsi did ingeniously, it said, let's do a blind tasting, because the thing that biases someone to buy a Coke is its brand. What if I take the brand out of the equation? What happens then? So they did a sample A, sample B, and people drank it, and guess what they liked? Pepsi. So then the sales took off, and that's exactly what Amrut did. To overcome that bias that this is Indian and might not be great, they struggled and they went to these bars and they kept doing these blind tastings, right? And then a lot of the whiskey veterans would say that this is Highland whiskey, and then they open it up and then that jars them. Like, oh, I can't believe this is made in India. So those are some of the highlights, but there were lots of these small, small things that they've done after that to constantly move up the value chain.
So, any of the surprising discoveries that you've probably not shared in the book, but you'd like to share with us here, that many of us won't know with the entire writing of the book?
Okay, I'll do the most macabre at one level. This is actually macabre. COVID. You guys recall what was the first things that opened during COVID? Any guesses what opened first?
Alcohol
Bars,
shops.
right? Why do you think that is? Right? So I'll give you a scary statistic, interesting statistic, whichever way you want to look at it. 2018, a report by the RBI on state finances, right? The collection of the excise, all India collection of the excise, was 1.51 trillion rupees. Okay? Guess how much our army budget was for 2018-19? 1.55 trillion. Okay, so all the money you collect over the booze can fund the second largest standing army in the world. That is some, and our states are so dependent, they cannot prohibit. So this actually paradoxically stands with our queasy relationship. Of course, we have the Gandhian impulse of temperance and prohibition, but how do you square that with the crores in Karnataka? 21% of its state budget comes from excise. How in the hell will Karnataka be able to remove that? That really started, a lot of these things which you don't understand, that really stood out for me. It made sense why libraries were closed, but alcohol shops were open during COVID, right? So that's some interesting things that came up as I wrote the book.
So, India has a love-hate relationship with alcohol, and there's a lot of regulations, around alcohol consumption. So, do you really think that this market has evolved now with Amrut having taken this place, in the global market?
Okay, so this is the classic line, right? Anything, I forget the man who said it, but that quote stays with me. Anything you say about India and the opposite, both are true in this country. While you will have a forward-looking state like Goa or a Karnataka with excise, you will also have bans from Bihar. So there's literally no one answer to this. But I will say one thing, from a global perspective, which I hope Indian alcohol industry does more, is export. We are very, very insignificant when it comes to global exports, because this is the make in India story, right? Again, you can't put alcohol in it because you have cogs and wheels and engineering in it. But this also, I think, we just export under 1% of the alcohol market. And so there's definitely room for alcohol companies to export into newer markets like Africa, other places. I think some of them are already doing it. That's one part. The second part of it is how the West views you now, right? At some level, we still haven't gotten over that colonial hangover. We still want that validation of the white man, for the good or for the bad. The West will not just look at you for cheap alcohol anymore. Amrut and the Indian single malt category has changed it. Thank you. One of the most expensive whiskeys sell for $2,000. I've heard stories. I didn't write it in the book, but I heard stories where there was a second market for it. People bought it and they resold it for a profit, right? And again, if you look at the Western gaze at this, a lot of these fancy whiskeys are saved for a big moment, either a 70th birthday, a kid's graduation. It was associated strongly with those moments in your high point of life. So that, for me, is brand equity. That's where you get associated with the high points of life. So these are some of the things that I think has evolved, and I hope to see more of this in this space.
So, Sriram, in your book, you've written about unclean water of India, right? And there was conversations around that. And obviously, Amrut has faced a lot of criticism. So, how do you think they persevered?
Yeah. So again, so they very nicely. What I will sort of go back and tell is one of the biggest challenges for brands from whatever I have seen is to commit to a quality, commit to a position. But what I think was very, very interesting about Amrut was that from the beginning, see, the award came in 2010, 2010. They were launched in 2006. So for 3 years, they had decided what their position was. They always said, we are Indian single malt. We are the finest from this country. So that clarity was insanely inspiring because everyone were laughing at them. I was talking to some more guys and they're like, when he started this, they're like, why are you even doing this? Who's even going to buy this? How can you do premium from an Indian perspective? So the idea that they persevered, firstly, they were clear about their brand positioning and they persevered. Despite all that, they kept saying taste. Why don't you give it a shot before you judge it, right? Without getting really defensive. And they're not bitter about and again, so adding to that as well. So that the NRIs initially, when it went abroad, were the harshest critics. They just didn't want to try it. It was the white so-called Caucasian influencers who picked it up and said, hey, this is good whiskey. So much so, I've heard anecdotes where families, there'll be guys sitting here in Bangalore or somewhere in the country, and they'll have a relative traveling from the US. They would ask those guys, hey, why don't you get me a bottle of that? So the bottle would leave Bangalore and come back because of someone else buying it in a duty-free shop, right? So it's come a long way from that perspective.
Okay, the last question, maybe just now, that what do you think the readers intend to take away from this book, and who did you write this book for? Because we know that media does not highlight Indian stories in a huge way, even now. And would you agree with that, Sriram? And what do you think we can change?
Yes, multiple levels. I've written it for a general audience because I don't have fancy business understanding. I understand it qualitatively and to some extent quantitatively. So my attempt really was the storytelling aspect of it. What are the nuances of a family firm? They almost shut down a couple of times. How did they overcome that? How are they feeling? The visceral human feeling of failure, distress, the judgment, the self-doubt. All of those things is what I have done. But it's not only that. There is also the regulation that I just said. How regulation affects how alcohol trade is done. We're like, you're selling it to 28 countries and union territories. You're not functioning in a single market. GST has happened for everything else but alcohol, right? So it still is a very, very challenging market to crack. Next is the logistics of it. The transport costs are very high in this country. If I remember right, 14% of the GDP. So they have to set up distilleries in every region instead of centralizing it and shipping it out. And regulation. So all of these things are covered. Not to mention the branding bit of it, how they've used Sangam literature in their branding, right? Shown our own. There's a funny anecdote the head distiller always says. I used to struggle. The head distiller was from Mayavaram, rural Tamil Nadu, had no background with alcohol. And
I'm
he would
so
always
sorry to
struggle.
interrupt. We are running short on time, so please keep it short. We'll be taking one
Yeah,
audience from the audience side, one
so are there
question.
any questions?
On request of our audience, please do the honors of completing the story, and then we would be taking one question from the audience side.
So he learned, like I said, Mr. Ashok was from Mayavaram. He didn't have any sense of alcohol. So when he started getting exposed to them, there was Glenfiddich. He didn't know how to say it, right? Auchentoshan. He would when I launch my own whiskey, I will make sure that it is so tough for the white man to read it. So that's why you would have Naidil, you would have the Indian names, and they'd be like struggling to say it, right? So that's a funny bit that he says. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Questions?
Attractive as a supplier of alcohol.
Okay. So this is one of the biggest myths, right? It's a very good branding strategy. All these big distillers show their brooks and say, we have this water. But typically, if you look at the whiskey guidelines, Scotch whiskey guidelines, your water cannot add any flavor, which means it just has to be pure. So water literally doesn't matter. It's just a branding ploy, which they use it well, right? So that is the That is, that's why I said it is a story. It's a branding ploy. If you look at how it's made, you boil out all the impurities and you use only water because you can't have impurities in the whiskey based on the guidelines.
All right, with this, we come to the Q&A session. Thank you for that question. And yes, can we have a huge round of applause for this amazing storyteller, author, and founder? I would like to invite, in this very occasion, Mr. Charita Ishwar onto the dais. Please do join us, and we will be having the auspicious occasion of launching the book of the Amrut, the Great Churn. Please do join us right here on the stage. Mr. Charita Ishwar is the founder catalyst for women entrepreneurship. She has been the India ambassador of 50 in Tech, advisor to G20. She has also is an advisor and mentor to all the women entrepreneurs out there. And yes, it is time for us to reveal and launch the Amrit, the Great Churn. Over to you. Can we have a huge round of applause for this, everyone? And as you can see, and yes, everyone, a huge round of applause for Amrit, the Great Churn.
Please do pick up a copy. I'm here if you want me to sign it for you. Thank you.
I also request Mr. Charita Ishwar to present the token of appreciation to our guests on the dais. Can we please have a token of appreciation for none other than the author of the book, The Amrit, the Great Churn? A huge round of applause, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Mohua Chinappa, for joining us and making this a wonderful session. And now I request Benedict to please join us on the dais to appreciate the gracious presence of Ms. Sucharita Ishwar. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. And yes, let's wait as they pose for a photograph.